Annabelle Hayes adjusted her rearview mirror as her silver car quietly turned onto a deserted road in the Dallas suburbs. Darkness blanketed the streets, with only the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off the car's sleek surface. Dressed in a shimmering sequin gown, she still carried the afterglow of the fundraising event. A meaningful evening dedicated to supporting the community center she deeply believed in. Tonight, they had raised a substantial amount to assist struggling families. But more than anything, Annabelle longed to return home, where her husband, Madam Hayes, was waiting. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights illuminated her rearview mirror like a nightmare. Annabelle frowned, her heartbeat quickening as she noticed a police patrol car tailing her closely. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a red light, hadn't even been on her phone. What had she done wrong? Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Annabelle pulled over and rolled down her window as the officer approached. The man was tall, his expression cold and unreadable, his gaze devoid of any friendliness. "License and registration," he said in a low, rigid tone, without a greeting. Annabelle quickly retrieved her documents from her purse and handed them over with a polite smile. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The man barely glanced at her license before responding curtly. "We received a call about a vehicle matching this description involved in suspicious activity in the area." Annabelle's heart skipped a beat. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated, keeping her voice calm. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered, ignoring her question. A cold chill ran down Annabelle's spine. Why were they treating her like a criminal? She turned her head and saw another patrol car pull up behind her. Two more officers stepped out, flashlights in hand, shining them directly at her as if she were a threat. Taking a steady breath, Annabelle unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. She kept her hands visible, following exactly what Madam had always advised her. Comply, don't argue. But when one of the officers started searching her trunk without permission, anger flared inside her. "I want to know why I'm being treated this way," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. Instead of answering, the youngest officer in the group smirked. "Just stand still, ma'am. We're just doing our job." Annabelle's gaze flicked to her phone resting on the passenger seat, its screen glowing with an incoming call from Madam. She needed to call him immediately, but just as she opened her mouth to request it, one of the officers cut her off. "You can do that after we're finished here." Her fingers clenched into fists. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated like a criminal. Should she stay silent? She knew this was the moment to speak up. Annabelle stood beside her car, arms crossed, her gaze locked onto the officers rummaging through her belongings with blatant disregard. Her breathing was slow and steady, but inside a storm was brewing. The cold night air brushed against her skin, but what she felt was something else entirely. A suffocating tension, a quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. The neatly arranged trunk of her car was now a mess. Flyers from the fundraiser lay scattered on the pavement, a few boxes of documents carelessly tossed aside. One of the officers, a young man with a wary expression, picked up a stack of the flyers, examining them suspiciously. "What's all this for?" he asked, his tone laced with doubt. Annabelle clenched her hands into fists, but remained composed. "Those are materials from the fundraiser I just attended," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I helped organize the event to support a local community center." The officer stared at her for a moment before, without a word, tossing the stack of papers back into the trunk with indifference. Annabelle swallowed the insult rising in her throat, biting down on her anger. The second officer, older and more self-assured, stepped closer, stopping just a few feet from her. Do you have any weapons, drugs, or anything illegal in the car? He asked, his voice firm. Annabelle raised an eyebrow. No, officer. Her voice remained calm, but the patience in it had all but vanished. I've told you I haven't done anything wrong. I'd like to know why I'm being treated this way. The older officer smirked slightly. We're just doing our job. Your job? Annabelle repeated, keeping her voice from trembling. Ransacking my car without probable cause? Refusing to give me a valid explanation? This is how you do your job? A heavy silence settled between them. The officers exchanged glances, but none of them answered. Annabelle's eyes flicked toward the passenger seat, where her phone was still vibrating with yet another call from Modem. She needed to speak to him now. May I retrieve my phone to call my husband? She asked, her voice steady despite the fire raging inside her. The youngest officer hesitated before glancing at his colleague and shrugging. No sudden movements, he warned, as if she were a threat. Annabelle bit back a sharp retort, carefully reaching into her car and picking up her phone. The officers watched her every move, their eyes trained on her like hawks, waiting for an excuse to escalate the situation. But Annabelle did exactly what she needed to do. She dialed Modem's number. He answered immediately. Annabelle, are you okay? I've been calling you. Annabelle met the officer's gaze as she spoke. Modem, I've been pulled over by the police. They're searching my car without cause. I need you here now. A deadly silence fell on the other end of the line. When Modem spoke again, his voice was low and hard, the worry gone, replaced by something else entirely. Where are you? She quickly gave him her location. Please hurry. She ended the call, her eyes never leaving the officers in front of her. They might not have known who she had just spoken to, but they could sense the shift in her demeanor. Minutes stretched endlessly. Annabelle remained still, unwavering. Passing drivers began to slow down, heads turning to take in the scene. The attention was growing, and then she heard it, the sound she had been waiting for. A deep, rumbling engine came to a stop nearby. A sleek black SUV pulled up, and the door swung open. Modem Hayes. His face was unreadable, but in his eyes, a storm raged. The streetlight caught the shine of the police badge clipped to his belt, gleaming like a warning. The officers instinctively straightened, their postures stiffening as realization dawned. This was no ordinary husband. This was the Dallas County Police Commissioner. And in that moment, they understood. The game had changed. Modem stepped out of the SUV with an air of quiet authority. His custom-tailored suit fit perfectly over his broad frame. But it wasn't the fine fabric that made the officers uneasy. It was the gleaming police badge clipped to his belt. The night air seemed to turn colder, or maybe it was just the officers standing before him, realizing that this was no ordinary situation. The older officer, who appeared to be in charge, instinctively took a small step back before quickly regaining his composure. "Good evening, sir," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "We were just conducting a routine security check." Modem stopped, surveying the scene. Annabelle stood firm by her car, arms crossed, her expression calm, but her eyes burned with restrained fury. Scattered on the ground were the fundraiser flyers, her belongings from the trunk haphazardly thrown about. He inhaled slowly before locking eyes with the officer. "Would you care to explain why my wife was pulled over and subjected to a vehicle search without her consent?" The officer blinked but maintained a professional facade. "Sir, we received a call about a vehicle matching this description being involved in suspicious activity in the area." Modem tilted his head slightly, his gaze razor-sharp. "Suspicious activity? Let me clarify," he said, his voice dangerously calm. You're telling me that a woman in an evening gown, leaving a high-profile charity event, was considered a suspect in suspicious activity? That's what you're saying." The older officer hesitated, but after a brief pause, he straightened his stance. "We didn't know her identity when we made the stop." "Did you ask for her identification?" Madam pressed. "Yes, sir." "Then you saw that she is Annabelle Hayes, my wife, the woman who just left a widely publicized fundraiser covered by multiple media outlets." Silence. The silence of someone whose flimsy excuse had just been torn apart. Madam shook his head and turned to Annabelle. "Did you consent to a search?" Annabelle's arms remained crossed as she responded, her voice sharp. "No." "Then they violated your rights." Madam turned back to the officers, his voice low and measured, each word striking like a hammer. "No search warrant, no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, and yet you proceeded to unlawfully search a citizen's vehicle." The youngest officer shifted uncomfortably, casting a nervous glance at his superior, but the older officer remained steadfast. "Sir, we were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Modem let out a cold chuckle. "Since when does protocol include disrespecting and violating the rights of a woman just because she happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time?" Murmurs spread through the small crowd that had gathered. A few people nodded in agreement. Some had even pulled out their phones, recording the encounter. The air was thick with tension. The older officer finally seemed to realize that the situation was slipping out of his control. He shot a glance at one of his subordinates, who immediately reached for his radio. Madam folded his arms, watching them like a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. "Who are you calling?" he asked. "We're contacting our superior." "Good," Madam said with a nod, "because I want to hear in front of all these witnesses exactly why my wife was treated like a criminal when she has done absolutely nothing wrong." The flashing police lights cast stark shadows on tense faces. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and then the sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. Another police SUV pulled up. The door swung open, and out stepped a man, Lieutenant Yike. His eyes scanned the scene swiftly, and when he saw Madam, his entire body tensed for just a fraction of a second. Clearly, this was not how he expected his night to unfold, but now it was too late to turn back. And at this moment, he too understood one thing. The situation had completely changed. The piercing sound of sirens shattered the tense silence. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its doors swinging open as Lieutenant Yikes stepped out, his polished badge gleaming under the harsh glow of the streetlights. His sharp gaze scanned the scene, and when his eyes landed on the man standing in the center of it all, Police Commissioner Madam, his expression barely concealed his shock. Yike was no stranger to tense situations. Throughout his career, he had faced countless high-pressure confrontations. But as he stood before the imposing figure of Modem, he knew this wasn't just another routine traffic stop gone wrong. This was a confrontation he couldn't control. Modem stood tall, his gaze unwavering as it locked onto Yikes. Beside him, Annabelle remained composed, though her posture radiated quiet defiance. The crowd of onlookers watched in anticipation, their smartphones still recording, waiting to see how this power struggle would unfold. Yikes straightened his jacket, attempting to maintain his authority. "Commissioner Madam," he greeted with a stiff nod, his voice professional yet laced with unease. "I wasn't expecting to see you here tonight." "You didn't need to," Madam replied, his tone steady, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "I just need one answer. Why was my wife pulled over and subjected to a vehicle search without cause?" Yike glanced briefly at the senior officer who had called him in. The man stood rigid, clearly avoiding his superior's gaze. We received a report about a vehicle matching this description being involved in suspicious activity. The officer stammered, grasping at a weak justification. Modem arched an eyebrow, his voice dropping to an icy calm. And did you find any evidence linking her car to any such activity? Silence. Annabelle crossed her arms, her sharp eyes narrowing. I committed no traffic violation. There was no reason for me to be stopped. But from the moment I pulled over, I was treated like a suspect, as if I had no right to question your actions. Yike exhaled slowly before turning to his subordinate. Did you ask for her consent before searching her vehicle? The officer hesitated. We thought, did you ask? Yike's voice hardened, leaving no room for excuses. No. A flicker of frustration crossed Yike's face. He turned back to Modem, his tone lowering. You're right, Commissioner. This was a mistake. Modem folded his arms, tilting his head slightly. A mistake? Or an abuse of power? Yike took a deep breath, aware that whatever he said next would be recorded, scrutinized, and potentially used against him and the department. I assure you there will be a full investigation, he said. We will review all body camera footage and issue a full report. Modem let out a cold chuckle. Body cameras? Let me guess, they accidentally malfunctioned during the search. A few in the crowd chuckled under their breath, though the tension remained suffocating. Nothing will be hidden, Yike stated firmly, and if any misconduct is found, there will be consequences. A long pause stretched between them. Then Modem took a measured step forward, his voice quiet but weighted with authority. I don't care for empty promises, Lieutenant. I care about action, and let me be very clear, I will not let this slide. Yike swallowed hard. He knew Commissioner Modem was not a man easily pacified by hollow apologies or vague assurances. This confrontation was far from over. Annabelle glanced at her husband before stepping forward. I was humiliated in the middle of this street. Now, I want an apology. The senior officer opened his mouth as if to protest, but then hesitated. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, the pressure of knowing he had no choice. I'm sorry, he muttered, reluctant yet resigned. Annabelle nodded, but there was no satisfaction in her expression. This was not a victory. This was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Modem turned back to Yike. You know what needs to be done. Make sure it's handled properly. Yike nodded, but deep down, he knew this investigation would be anything but simple, and if any wrongdoing was uncovered, it could set off a chain of consequences he wasn't prepared for. The confrontation might have settled for now, but the truth had yet to be fully revealed. And as the night stretched on, one undeniable reality loomed over them all. Justice could not stay buried forever. Annabelle sat in the living room, the warm glow of the lamp casting soft shadows across her resolute face. Outside, the night had settled in, but in her mind, the events of the evening still burned like a fire refusing to die. She set her teacup down, eyes shifting to her husband, Police Commissioner Modem, who was silently reading through a report on his laptop. How far do you think this will go? Annabelle asked, her voice calm yet carrying an undercurrent of strength. Modem didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the lines in front of him. Internal complaints, misconduct reports, and most damning of all, the history of the officers who had stopped Annabelle the night before. The numbers didn't lie. This wasn't the first time. He closed his laptop and met her gaze. As far as it needs to, he said, his voice low but firm. Annabelle understood. She wasn't the first, but she would make sure she was the last. Modem's phone buzzed with an incoming message. Yike, we need to meet. Now 30 minutes later, Modem stepped into a quiet cafe downtown. The place was nearly empty, just a few patrons scattered throughout. In the farthest corner, Yike sat waiting, his expression more serious than ever. As Madam took a seat, Yike slid a thick folder across the table. "I've looked into everything," he said, tension lacing his voice. "And I think you need to see this." Madam flipped open the file. The pages were dense with text, but it wasn't the data that caught his attention. It was the handwritten notes attached. Misconduct complaints, never investigated. Body cameras malfunctioned 4 times in 3 months. Discrimination claims, ignored by upper command. Madam's eyes flicked to Yike. "How long have you known about this?" "Not long," Yike exhaled, "but long enough to know that if this gets out, it's gonna shake the entire department." Madam clenched his fists on the table. "And are you planning to cover it up?" Yike's gaze was sharp. "No," he said firmly, "I can't, and I won't." A long silence settled between them. Both men knew they stood at a pivotal crossroads. "We need to take this public," Madam said slowly. "So that means—" "It means I'm bringing this to light, but I need to know, where do you stand?" Yike met his eyes without hesitation. "I stand with the truth," he said, "even if it means going against those I once trusted." Madam nodded. "Then let's begin." The next day, at an emergency press conference, reporters crammed into the large hall of the police headquarters. Camera flashes flickered like lightning, capturing what could be the beginning of a major scandal. Madam stepped onto the podium, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Beside him, Yike stood tall, his expression unwavering. "What happened last night to my wife was not an isolated incident," Madam began, his voice steady and powerful. "It is part of a much larger problem, one that has been ignored for far too long." The room fell into complete silence. "In the past months, we have uncovered systemic violations," he continued. "Unwarranted stops, illegal searches, and conveniently malfunctioning body cameras during critical moments." Murmurs rippled through the press. Some journalists were already scribbling furiously. "But today," Madam declared, "we will not let this continue." He turned slightly to Yike, who gave a small nod before speaking. "As a law enforcement officer, I took an oath to protect this community," Yike said, "and I cannot stay silent when injustice occurs within our own ranks." A reporter raised a hand. "What's your next course of action?" Madam looked straight into the camera. "There will be a full-scale investigation. Those who have violated their oath, no matter their rank, will face consequences." The room erupted into noise, but Madam remained focused. He knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one he couldn't afford to lose. Beside him, Annabelle stood quietly, pride shining in her eyes. They weren't just fighting for her, they were fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced by injustice. And this time, the truth would not be buried. The atmosphere in the press conference room was thick with tension, nearly tangible in the air. Camera flashes flickered nonstop as reporters thrust their microphones toward the podium. Annabelle sat in the front row, silently watching her husband, Commissioner Madam, standing at the center of a media storm. Beside him, Lieutenant Yike maintained his stoic expression, but his eyes held something different, not fear, but resolve. Madam took a deep breath before speaking. "Today, we are not just addressing a single mistake. We are confronting a problem deeply embedded within the system." The room fell into immediate silence. "What my wife experienced is not an isolated incident," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the reporters. "It is a glaring example of a reality many citizens endure: abuse of power, bias, and a failure of responsibility from those sworn to protect us." The sound of papers shuffling echoed as journalists hurriedly scribbled down his every word. One reporter raised his hand and called out, "Commissioner, can you clarify what this means for the police force?" Muddam locked eyes with the journalist, his voice unwavering. "It means that those who abuse their power will have nowhere to hide. A full-scale investigation has already begun, and I promise you, no matter who they are, no matter their rank, if they have violated their duty, they will be held accountable." A murmur spread through the room. Annabelle tightened her hands, feeling the weight of every word her husband spoke. This wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration of war against a broken system. Another reporter stood up and challenged, "Aren't you concerned that this will divide the department? That some will resist these changes?" This time, Yike responded, his voice firm. "The truth may make some people uncomfortable, but that is no reason to hide it. If anyone feels threatened by accountability, then perhaps they should never have worn this uniform in the first place." His words cut through the room like a blade, leaving a moment of stunned silence. A woman stood up, a seasoned reporter judging by her demeanor. "Annabelle, do you have anything you'd like to say?" All eyes turned to her. Annabelle took a deep breath, stood up, and walked to the podium. "When I was pulled over that night," she said, her voice calm but commanding, "I felt powerless. I knew I had done nothing wrong, but that didn't matter. To them, I was just someone they needed to control." The room remained utterly still, everyone hanging on to her words. "But today, I stand here not to speak about my fear or my anger," she continued. "I stand here to say that we can and must change. No one should feel like a target simply for existing." Her words echoed throughout the room. The expressions on the reporters' faces shifted from curiosity to respect. Muddam looked at his wife, pride swelling in his chest. He knew that after today, he wasn't fighting this battle alone. They had a new leader, a voice the community would listen to. The fight ahead would be long, but this time, power alone would not dictate the outcome. At last, the truth had a voice. Annabelle stood beside her husband, Commissioner Muddam, her gaze sweeping over the packed press conference room. The crowd buzzed with energy, but she remained calm. In front of them, reporters fired off questions, microphones pointed at the podium like weapons ready to devour anyone who dared to speak. Today, this was no longer a battle fought in the shadows. Everything had come into the light. Muddam stood tall before the sea of curious, expectant faces. His voice rang out, strong, measured, controlled. "We are not here to cover up or shift blame. We are here to ensure that what happened to my wife and to countless other citizens never happens again." A storm of camera shutters clicked in rapid succession, flashes illuminating the room as reporters leaned forward, predatory in their pursuit of the next big story. "Commissioner," one journalist called out, voice sharp, "can you clarify your next steps? What will happen to the officers who unlawfully stopped and searched your wife?" Muddam did not flinch. He met the reporter's gaze directly, his voice unwavering. "I have ordered an immediate investigation. The officers involved have been placed on suspension pending the outcome. I will not protect anyone, no matter who they are." A ripple of tension spread through the room. Another reporter stood, their tone edged with skepticism. "But this could create division within the force. Are you concerned about backlash?" Before Muddam could respond, Lieutenant Yike stepped forward, his expression unshaken. "If anyone in this department feels uncomfortable being held accountable, then perhaps they should never have worn this uniform in the first place." Silence. Only the relentless clicking of cameras remained. Annabelle took a deep breath before speaking. Her voice wasn't loud, but each word carried undeniable weight. "When I was stopped that night, I wasn't the wife of a commissioner. I was just another woman. I did everything right. I complied. I didn't resist. But that didn't matter. To them, I was just someone to control. The room was utterly still, every person hanging on her words. But today, she continued, her eyes sweeping across the faces before her, we are not standing here to ask for sympathy. We are standing here to demand change. Applause erupted from the back of the room, one voice at first, then another, until it swelled into a wave. The crowd was no longer just an audience, they had become part of the story. Beside Annabelle, Madam squeezed her hand. They had started a battle, and today they had made the world listen. Annabelle stood on the steps of the government building, her sharp gaze sweeping over the crowd before her. The media, social activists, and ordinary citizens had gathered, waiting for every word she was about to say. Beside her, Commissioner Modem maintained a solemn expression, his deep-set eyes carrying an unshakable resolve. Can we accept a system where justice is a privilege, not a right? Annabelle's voice rang out, each word cutting through the air like a blade. The crowd murmured. Cameras were raised high, recording every moment. She knew she was standing on the threshold of change, and she had no intention of stepping back. That night I committed no crime. I did nothing wrong, yet I was stopped, interrogated, humiliated, all because of bias and abuse of power. She paused, letting her words sink in as her eyes scanned the faces before her. If this could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. A voice from the crowd called out, "We stand with you, Annabelle." She allowed herself a small smile, but did not let emotion deter her focus. Beside her, Madam stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding, carrying across the tense atmosphere. The investigation is underway, and I promise you, it will not be silenced or buried. We will uncover the truth, and those who have abused their power will be held accountable. A reporter quickly raised a question. Are you concerned that this move will create division within the police force? Modem answered without hesitation. If upholding justice causes division, then the system was flawed from the start. We cannot tolerate injustice in the name of maintaining order. His words ignited a wave of applause. Lieutenant Yike, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward as well. I've served in this force for years, he said. I know there are officers who are dedicated to their duty, but if we don't remove those who abuse their power, we betray the very people we swore to protect and serve. Annabelle nodded, adding, Today, we are not just speaking for me. We are speaking for all those who have remained silent, for those who have suffered injustice but never had the chance to stand here and tell their story. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in unity. This was no longer just Annabelle's story. It was the story of every person who longed for justice, and today the world was finally listening. The courtroom was packed, the tension so thick it was suffocating. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting streaks of light across the jury box, where a group of individuals bore the heavy responsibility of determining the truth. Annabelle sat at the defense table, her expression calm, but her gaze razor-sharp as it swept across every face in the room. Before her, Yike, the lieutenant who had once been part of the system, but now stood as a witness against it, adjusted his tie before looking toward the prosecutor. Lieutenant Yike? The prosecutor began, his voice measured. Can you confirm that the evidence we just presented is entirely legitimate and has not been tampered with? Yike nodded, his voice firm. Yes, all the evidence, including the body camera footage and witness testimonies, is undeniable. At the plaintiff's table, the accused officer, Parabel, the man responsible for the unlawful stop and humiliation of Annabelle, sat pale-faced. Once a confident officer who thrived on his unchecked power, he now looked like a trapped animal with no escape. The prosecutor continued, "Lieutenant, in your opinion, was this incident a misunderstanding, or does it indicate a pattern of abuse?" Yike took a deep breath, his eyes shifting to Parabal. "This was no misunderstanding. It is part of a long-standing pattern of misconduct that has been tolerated for years. Officers like Parabal believed they could act without consequence, but today we are proving that no one is above the law." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The press recorded every second, waiting for the moment of judgment. Madam, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. As the police commissioner, he could not ignore his duty. "We are not here just to judge one man." His voice rang out with unwavering strength. "We are here to set a precedent that this system must change. Justice cannot be bent by privilege." The judge tapped the gavel against the bench, signaling for the jury to deliver the verdict. The entire courtroom held its breath. The foreman of the jury stood, unfolding a slip of paper, his voice clear and resolute. "We, the jury, after careful deliberation of all evidence and testimony, find the defendant, Parabal, guilty." The room erupted. Applause broke out from the public gallery. Annabelle closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the wave of emotions wash over her. Parabal hung his head, his hands clenched into fists. What he had believed would never happen had now become reality. But for Annabelle, this was not the end. This was only the beginning of a much greater fight, the fight for justice for all who had ever been wronged. The courtroom fell into a chilling silence after the verdict was announced. No more excuses, no more power to hide behind. Parabal, the officer who once believed he could manipulate the truth, now sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if clinging to one last shred of hope. But it was over. Annabelle rose from her seat, taking a deep breath. Her gaze swept across the courtroom, finally resting on Modem, the man who had stood for justice from the very beginning. He gave her a slight nod, a silent confirmation that they had accomplished what many thought was impossible. But Parabal refused to accept reality. "This is a setup," he burst out, his voice twisted with panic. "I was just doing my job. You're ruining my life." The judge slammed the gavel down, eyes cold as steel. "Officer Parabal, I advise you to remain silent. Your lies have been exposed. Justice has been served." A murmur spread through the crowd. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed in rapid succession. The media wouldn't let this moment slip away, a historic moment where a corrupt officer was finally brought to light, unable to escape consequences. Annabelle turned to Yike, the officer who had once been part of the system but had the courage to stand against it. He sat with his hands clasped, his face thoughtful. He knew today's victory didn't mean the war was over. There were still more Parabals out there, officers who used their badges to manipulate power and oppress the innocent. Modem stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over every officer in the room. "I hope today serves as a powerful reminder," he said, his voice low and commanding. "We cannot protect those who abuse their power. If we want to regain the trust of the people, we must hold ourselves accountable." A heavy silence filled the room. No one dared to challenge his words. Annabelle moved beside Modem, determination burning in her eyes. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice steady but firm. "We exposed one abuser, but how many more are still hiding in the dark?" Modem met her gaze, a newfound respect in his expression. "We keep going," he said. "The truth must always come to light." Behind them, Parabal was handcuffed and led out of the courtroom. He was no longer an officer. He was just a man who had lost everything because he dared to believe he was above justice. As Annabelle and Madam stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the bright sunlight bathed them in warmth. But this wasn't just another day. This was the day justice prevailed, the day the truth forced the liars to bow. And they knew this was only the beginning of a much longer fight. Annabelle's story is more than just a courtroom revelation. It is a powerful reminder of responsibility, courage, and perseverance in the face of injustice. In a world where power can be abused to conceal the truth, Annabelle and Modem proved that justice can still prevail if there are people brave enough to stand for it. We cannot remain silent in the face of wrongdoing, nor can we allow fear to force us into submission under those who manipulate authority. Justice does not exist on its own. It requires individuals like Annabelle, like Madam, and like all those willing to fight for the truth. A lie may be hidden for a time, but the light of truth will always find its way through. And more importantly, change does not begin with those in power, but with the citizens who dare to speak out. Those who understand that no one is above the law and that no one deserves to be treated unjustly because of bias or prejudice. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.